Det är sedan många år en tradition att när Sveriges främsta journalister belönas så bjuds också en internationell gäst in till prisceremonin. Och ikväll ska ni få träffa en prisbelönt journalist och författare. Han har skrivit flera böcker om Balkan. Han har varit BBC:s chefskorrespondent i Östeuropa. Men just nu så väcker han stor internationell beundran, det måste man säga, för sitt enorma arbete bakom boken Mafia. I den kartlägger han den organiserade brottsligheten från brottssyndikat i Östeuropa till marijuanaindustrin i Kanada, till människosmugglare i Mellanöstern, cyberbrottslingar i Nigeria till den japanska maffian Yakuza. Han reste runt i nästan 4 år och träffade åklagare, poliser, advokater, journalister, forskare, brottsoffer, men också brottslingarna själva. Please give a warm welcome to Misha Glenny.
Hi, Karin.
Please. Before we start, or actually starting like this, these tremendous guys, a picture from your book. I mean, one would die to meet them. Can you tell us something about them?
They're from Varna in Bulgaria, which is on the Black Sea coast of Bulgaria. And that picture was taken in about 2002. And Varna was controlled at that time, still is. I hope there are no Bulgarians in the audience, by an organization called TIM, T-I-M, which was one of 3 or 4 major umbrella gangster organizations that basically emerged in Bulgaria after the collapse of communism, because it wasn't just communism that collapsed, it was the state that collapsed as well. And so you didn't have a functioning police force, you didn't have a functioning judicial system. And so instead, the new capitalist and business class that was emerging in Bulgaria, they needed people to make sure that their contracts, when they entered into a contract, were enforced properly. And so they met these guys who used to be, under communism, the sort of superstars of communism, which were weightlifters, wrestlers, boxers, and so on, you know, who we saw every 4 years would clear up at the Olympics. And they weren't being subsidized by the state anymore either. And so there was this coming together of the new business class and these unemployed wrestlers. And the wrestlers became what one refers to sociologically as privatized law enforcement agencies, but which traditionally we know better under the word mafia.
But this was in 2002, and you've been covering then the Balkans for years.
Yeah.
But there is a specific date, the 15th of March 2003, when you more or less decided to write this book.
That was in March 2003
What
when
happened?
the Prime Minister of Serbia, Zoran Đinđić, was assassinated. And Zoran I had known for about 15 years.
As a friend of yours.
We were friends. And Zoran was doing this extraordinary task of trying to take Serbia from the 19th century to the 21st century in the space of about 3 years.
But you also refer to him as a gangster.
Well, he was, because anyone involved in politics in the former Yugoslavia at the time had to finance their operations. And the entire economy, and this was accentuated by the fact that UN sanctions had been placed on Serbia, the entire economy was criminalized. So if you wanted to be a politician, you needed to have your own mob. And
So you would refer to
Zoran
him
had
as a good gangster?
A good gangster. I call Zoran a good gangster because he was aware of what he was doing and what his historical role ought to be, i.e. moving the country forward and getting rid of the Milosevic heritage. And actually the reason why he was assassinated was because 3 months before the killing, he had introduced the first ever Witness Protection Act in the Balkans. i.e. if somebody wanted to come and give evidence against a gangster, they would get the protection of the state, and that's why he had to be killed.
But then you decided to investigate organized crime. One could imagine that you could have stopped with the Balkans. I mean, clearly there was enough to cover there, but you didn't know. You went for the whole world.
I went for the whole world for the following reason.
There was no editor saying we have some sort of delimitation problem here, or Misha?
There is, actually. I'll be perfectly honest with you here. In very cynical terms, if you go to a publishing house and say, I want to write a book on the Balkan Mafia, they will raise their eyes to the ceiling and say, yeah, right, okay, but it won't sell. If you say, I want to write a book about the global mafia and how they're all getting together, then they will say, that's great, and go ahead and do it. But there was a very specific reason for this. This is when I started investigating the issue of Zoran's murder, of Djindjic's murder, what I realized that under the cover of war in Yugoslavia, the various mafias had been using it to turn the Balkans into a big distribution zone for illicit goods and services that were coming from Afghanistan, that were coming from West Africa, that were coming from South America. And they were being channeled into the Balkans and moved towards their market, which is Western Europe. Because as the Balkans was collapsing into war, Western Europe, thanks to the glory of financial capitalism, was becoming one of the most, if not the most, affluent consumer markets in history. This happened in Sweden as much as it did in the United Kingdom.
So what did you do? I mean, what was your method? Did you follow the trail of the illicit goods, or?
Well, first of all, I started to, I mean, in the Balkans, I'm a kind of A-list celebrity, the sort of European equivalent of being big in Japan. And so I chatted to lots of people in the Balkans, and they all knew who I was, and so it was very easy. And I got to the bad guys pretty quickly in the Balkans, because I've been speaking to them for the past 13 or 14 years.
And some of them were your friends?
Anyhow, and some of them were my friends, we've established, and some of them were murdered, and so on and so forth. The difficult bit was when you go out of your comfort zone of somewhere like the Balkans and you pitch up in Cali in Colombia to try and speak to the FARC and to, you know, engage with the cocaine trade inside Colombia.
Hold on for a second. Most of us can imagine setting up a meeting with a law enforcement official or maybe even a victim of crime. But how do you actually set up a meeting with FARC or a drug dealer?
Well, one thing I have to say is that sometimes trying to meet a law enforcement official is more difficult than trying to meet a gangster. But that's another story. It depends where you are. What you have to do, the absolutely critical thing that you have to do is know people in the country you're going to beforehand. Now, I had worked as a correspondent for the BBC, which gave me a huge advantage because I could ring up anyone. I could ring up, for example, I did some research in Israel, and I could ring up the Jerusalem and Tel Aviv offices of the BBC, the correspondent I knew from the Balkans, and I said to her, I said, Orla, can you find, who's your best local journalist who engages with the underworld?
But why did
that's how you do it,
why
basically.
did the criminals or the criminal insiders want to talk to you in the first place? What were they gaining from that?
Well, there were a variety of reasons. Sometimes it was because of friendships and relationships that they were prepared to do it. Some of the gangsters, particularly in Eastern Europe, and this is Russia and Eastern Europe as well, not just the Balkans, they felt that they had got a very bad press, that when communism had collapsed, they were the only people, they said, who were keeping the economy moving. And, you know, and they should be regarded not as gangsters, but as entrepreneurs who saved everyone. Now, I have to say, I think there's some justification for this in what they were saying.
So you were some sort of their PR agent then?
No, I wasn't their PR agent. I just did what I was trying to do by explaining their stories was saying that this is not, you know, Don Corleone in the 1950s and 1960s. This is a rather different historical circumstance, and you are dealing with utter chaos in the world where, and certainly in the former Soviet Union, where authority had collapsed. You know, and this is what we wanted, after all. I mean, we wanted the end of communism. So we have to engage with what was actually going on there.
But I'm curious about the real meetings. I mean, you came there as a journalist. Were you totally open with your mission? Why you were there?
Absolutely open. If you go there and say, you know, I'm sort of a representative of this company and I'm trying to work out what's going on in Odessa at the moment because I'm thinking of investing here, and they find out that you're a journalist, you're gone, you're dead, it's all over. So what I used to do is I used to tell them beforehand through the intermediary that I was a journalist. The amazing thing is if you're not working for television or a newspaper, but you're writing a book, they become much more relaxed about it because they don't think the books have any influence in the world. And they may have a point there, you never know.
We'll get back to that.
And, so I would go there. The tensest meeting I had, or the tensest 2 meetings I had, were in Odessa when I met one of the 2 Mr. Bigs in Odessa. And he was a really nasty piece of work, and all the people around him were thick-necked and very heavy, and he was suspicious, and I was given a list of questions beforehand that I could not ask.
Type of questions like?
Oh, like anything to do with what was going on at that moment. I was allowed to ask questions up until 1997-98. In 97, there was a big bloodbath in Odessa, and after that, he had become one of the 2 big gangster figures there. So the historical stuff, which actually at the time was what interested me, I was able to ask. But anything that could have been used as intelligence, not so much for the police, who were all in his pay, but for his main rival, his competitor, that I wasn't allowed to ask.
So what did you think about that, those conditions?
Oh, you know, you accept them. Look, you're dealing with gangsters who kill people for a living, and so, you know, your room for maneuver is limited. Now, there are issues here of journalistic integrity and so on and so forth, and I was battling with that in every country that I went to. I mean, from the simple point of view that, for example, for China, I went to China on a tourist visa. You know, I did not go as a journalist, because if I'd have applied to the Chinese embassy saying, I want to come and study organized crime in the People's Republic, I wouldn't have got in.
But describe for us, how were you thinking about those issues yourself, these ethical dilemmas that you had ended up in?
What I felt it was really important to do is that you had this explosion of the underground economy. It's an unregulated economy. It is encouraged by government policies, and it is very damaging to many hundreds of millions of people's well-being. And that what I wanted to do was do the first mapping of what I call the global underground economy, so that it would be something that other people could build on, that you had a framework of reference, of understanding, in particular also in the West, that our well-being and our opulence is often built upon the utter misery of hundreds of millions of people in the developing world.
How much did you actually knew before you started, and how much were knowledge you just sort of caught up with during your journey, or during your journeys?
I think the specifics is what I learnt when I went there. For example, when I went to Brazil, I started off looking at the gangs in Brazil, which I did write about, but then as soon as I got there, I discovered that one of the big industries in Brazil was cybercrime. That, you know, and this is counterintuitive, because you think cybercrime, well, America, maybe Sweden, who knows, and China and India and so on. But Brazil is a huge center of cybercrime. And it's a society, you know, I'd come from Dubai, looking into money laundering in Dubai, where, you know, you cannot get a single person to talk, on the record, off the record. They're all terrified. You go to Brazil and you cannot stop people talking. And the good thing is that included the criminal hackers as well. And I got friendly with this group of criminal hackers who had committed a very big crime. And they showed me in great detail how they did it. And I then went and interviewed the police who had busted them. Half of them were arrested, half of them weren't. And I felt, you know, this is really good stuff. I've got the story from both sides. It was really.
But one wonders then, you traveled for almost 4 years. How did you finance this?
I financed it because I wrote, if I say so myself, a very good proposal for the book.
Must have been fantastic.
It was 60 pages long. It took me 6 months to write. And I got a big advance from the UK and the US. But this is a really important point because investigative journalism is getting incredibly difficult. Investigative journalism that involves cross-border work is nigh on impossible because we're all seeing traditional media bases, revenue sources shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And so those people who want to be engaged in it have to A, start cooperating, and B, start being very creative about how they finance these things. And they're incredibly important. All of the sort of investigative stuff, which in the 60s and 70s was, in a sense, the staple diet of journalism, it's disappearing, and we have to keep it going.
Was it just a coincidence that you choose to publish this in a book, or could it have been made in a series of articles?
No, I had to do it in a book. I don't think it could have been done in a series of articles because it would have. I mean, the book in itself, in a sense, is it's a series of stories. But because it comes together in one form, it means you can refer back to what is going on all the time, and you can pick up certain stories. For example, the thing of human trafficking women for sexual purposes. I could talk about what was going on in that between China and Dubai, for example, and then come back to it in China when discussing the issue of the trafficking of people for
you mentioned earlier that we see
purposes.
many more books when it comes to investigative journalism today. Do you think that's an advantage or a disadvantage, or does it even matter?
I think it matters very, very deeply. The more books we have, the better it is.
Is the impact the same as it would have been published in, say, New York Times?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, one mustn't. The New York Times, fine publication though it is, has been through some torrid times over the past 10 years or so, and it is not the kind of huge standard bearer that it was. I know from the BBC, we can do, who I used to work for, I haven't done for many years, but I still do freelance stuff for them, is that the BBC is able to do investigations in the United Kingdom very effectively. But it does not have as many resources to do the investigation elsewhere in the world. And this is it's a matter of real concern to me.
Finally, we brought this beautiful globe just for you. Could you point out a place where you say, no, there's no organized crime?
No, it's absolutely impossible.
Okay.
I happen to be sitting here next to North Korea, which has been in the news, obviously, for the past couple of days. And North Korea is a vital part of the global underground economy, I can tell you that.
Okay, that's depressing as it sounds. It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you,
welcome.
Misha Glenny.